Oh my God. The Pope, the brand new American Pope, is a Leo. It's true, y'all. He's a Leo. I mean, astrologically speaking, he's a Taurus, but he's taken on the name Leo. Pope Leo the 14th, Robert Prevost. And I don't know how to feel, really. I mean, I woke up, I saw the headline, First American Pope, and I immediately was bummed because I'm like, oh God, I'm not ready for this. I had an episode about Pope Francis and his legacy and a bit of the debate on his life, and also a bit at the end about what the next Pope could look like. And I had this whole thing about how I think it would be more about the demographics of the growing Catholic Church and probably be someone from the global South. I did not expect it to be someone from the United States. Most people didn't. Like, I was reading a lot of articles at the time about people's different theories and some of the candidates that seemed likely, and nobody mentioned this guy. I never heard of this guy. And I think a lot of people were really shocked. The first American Pope, y'all. But then I looked into it. Oh, yeah. I mean, the reason I was bummed was like, I immediately assumed that this guy's probably not one of the progressive ones. And then I also was just like, oh no, I'm not ready for like the MAGA response to this. Like, yes, finally we got our Pope in there. And I was thinking maybe he would be like a super conservative. But then I looked into him a bit, and he's okay. He's a Pope. If you listen to that episode where I talked about Pope Francis, I was like really talking about the debate you see among progressives over like, is he really progressive? Is he really conservative? And how Pope Francis didn't really fit neatly into that binary. But ultimately, I see Pope Francis's legacy as he was just really a traditionalist, conservative Catholic who just took his faith seriously. And when you take your faith seriously and you take the Bible seriously, then you wind up having some pretty radical views. I wrote this book behind me, The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus, kind of about that idea that, like, yeah, if you're really to dig into this Jesus, of course you'd find yourself fighting for justice in this world, even if that means standing against the oppressive Christian institutions that do so much violence in the name of Jesus. And so that's also why Pope Francis was very much about helping the poor and saving the planet, doing everything we can to curb climate change, was against Trump's anti-immigration policies. And J.D. Vance, big beef at the end of his life. And this new pope apparently also had a little bit of beef with J.D. Vance. I found this meme that this guy, Rinse Wind Run, posted on Blue Sky of a little bit of a summary of the immediate reaction that we saw from progressives. He said, like, the announcement was, new pope, crowd goes wild. Next announcement, American Pope, crowd boos. Announcement, woke for an American, crowd goes wild. But bad on protecting abusive priests, crowd boos. But also hates J.D. Vance, crowd goes wild. And that, yeah, I've been seeing that all over my feeds today, just back and forth of people like not sure how to feel about him. But what's funny too, yeah, we'll get into some of the conservative response to is especially funny to see, of like people being like, yeah, our American Pope, and then others being like, woke Pope again, no. But anyway, before we get into this next Leo, I want to talk about the past Leos. This is the 14th Leo. And so I was digging through Wikipedia today, and I wanted to know about the other Leos because I was surprised that he took on this to be the 14th Leo. And we're going to talk a bit about some of the more interesting Leos that I was reading about. And trust me, I think you'll find it interesting too, because each of the Leos was actually like in a very surprisingly very historic shift in church history. Each of these Leos. And so stick around. We're gonna get deep into the Leos today. Shout out all the astrological Leos out there. I appreciate y'all. I'm a Pisces. I don't know what that means for our relationship, but maybe some of you listening to this was like, I knew it. I knew Damon was a Pisces. I felt it. Hey, shout out. Thanks for being here. But before we get to that, I want to shout out Theology Beer Camp. It's going to be in St. Paul, Minnesota, October 16th to the 18th. It's a super cool event. I've been going the last 2 years, and I'm going again this year as one of the podcasters. They got academics and theological podcasters, and it's a fun time. I always meet really cool people when I go. It's going to be some really cool talks and panels and a lot of cool people that you can meet, including me. It would be cool to meet some of you there. And early bird ticket price ends in like a week. So go to theologybeer.camp. Look at the information on there. Look at all the speakers that are going to be there. Read into them. See if you could go, especially if you're close to Minnesota. That would be really cool to see some of y'all there. Check it out. I'll be there. Now let's move on. Leo. 1. Leo the First. Saint Leo the Great is what they call him. He was the Pope from the year 440 to 461. And this Pope, way back, early church, early, when they're having a lot of these councils debating theology. And it's interesting, in the early church, the Pope was simply the bishop or the pastor of the church that was just bigger than the other churches, which just happened to be Rome, especially because of how big and affluent Rome was. And so when these pastors of all these different churches were able to start gathering together after the Roman Empire stopped persecuting Christians, you had all these pastors coming together for the first time, talking about the ways that they can be united, and they felt like they needed a leader. And the pastor of the biggest church was the pastor of Rome, and that became the leader of the church, later called the Pope, which for a while he was just called the bishop. And so for Leo the First, there was a lot of theological debates going on, particularly around if Jesus was fully human and fully divine, or just fully human or just fully divine. And if he is fully human and fully divine, how does that make, how are you 100% one thing and 100% the other thing? What is the mystery behind this? And there are some people that wanted to go a more logical approach and say, no, there's no way he could be both at the same time. It has to be one or the other. Others being like, no, this is a spiritual mystery. We just have to go with it. And a whole bunch went into the motivations behind people taking these different positions. But for Leo the First, he wanted to make sure that it was solidified in these councils that Jesus was fully human, fully divine, and he even was fighting against majorly the what would be called heretics that were saying Jesus was just fully divine. And it was really important for them. And it was also really important for Leo to get that out of there. And there was something that I found really interesting when I was reading about this is a major reason that Leo gave for arguing that Jesus was fully human and fully divine was to say, if Jesus was just divine, then Jesus's divinity was crucified only. Only his divinity was crucified, and therefore only his divinity was resurrected. Which would therefore mean that there's no hope for us humans for any sort of future resurrection. If Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, as Paul says, for a greater resurrection, no matter what you believe that looks like, then anything Jesus did doesn't really apply to us if he wasn't human, if he was just divine. And the reason I found that really interesting is because I find myself having very similar thoughts as the years go on, but especially lately, as I've been thinking more about my thoughts on Jesus and what still inspires me about the person of Jesus. And I've been leaning more and more into the human Jesus. I'm sure you could really tell that if you read my book, The God Who Riots. But it's just becoming more and more lately. And what's funny is now it's to an extent that I'm sure Leo the First would consider me a heretic of just the opposite extreme of Jesus being fully human. Because for me, it's Jesus was human. Was Jesus divine? That's not as important to me. I'm I don't know. But the reason I don't want to lean so much on Jesus' divinity is for the exact same reason that Leo gives here, which is this whole thing Jesus was doing and why he gathered followers was so that we do what Jesus did. We live the type of life that Jesus lived. So the more human that Jesus is in our interpretation of Jesus' life, then the more true that calling for us becomes. And the more and more I lean into Jesus was fully human, and maybe we should read some of the supernatural stuff more metaphorically, the more I'm inspired to live like Jesus, because the more I'm inspired to believe that I can live like Jesus. Yeah, that was just a random tangent that I wanted to throw in here, that I'm leaning more and more and more into the human Jesus, and it's for the same reason that Leo the First gives here. So I found it interesting that it's if Jesus is just divine, there's no hope for humans. And now I'm a heretic on the other side. But this is a podcast, and this is a place where I can also just talk about some of the things I'm just thinking about and don't have fully developed. And so there's a little bit of that. Sorry for those who want me to go a bit deeper on this, but we got to move on to Pope Leo IX, who was Pope from 1049 to 1054. And if you are a bit familiar with church history, then that date, 1054, should stick out to you, because 1054 was the date of the Great Schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. See, another historical pope, this guy. And some of you may not know this history at all. I grew up Protestant, Pentecostal, and I knew nothing of the Eastern-Western schism. And I was taught basically that it was the Catholic Church for a really long time, and then Martin Luther in the 1500s split off, Protestants finally split off from the Catholic Church, and this was like the first big break. But no. 500 years before that, there was this split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and through that split, you get the Western Church fully identifying as the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Church as the Eastern Orthodox Church. Both, I mean, the word Catholic initially just meant universal or global. And that's why it's like, there's some old prayers that will say, like, be praying for the Holy Catholic Church. Initially, that just meant the whole church, the Holy Global Church. And what's funny is the Western Church, keeping that name Catholic, is kind of a dig at the Eastern Church of saying, like, we're the real church. Like, we're still the global church and y'all don't really count. And then the Eastern Church calling themselves the Orthodox Church is a similar dig of like, yeah, y'all are over there being heretics, but we're the Orthodox. We're the correct ones over here. And so they both consider themselves the one true church that goes back to Jesus. But I knew nothing of the Eastern Orthodox Church and churches, and I was able to learn about them years ago. But when I did, I was like, why did nobody tell me about this? But that whole thing started out, I mean, there was many as the church grew and got more spread out, cultural differences kept growing between the Eastern churches and the Western churches. And there was the bishop or the patriarch of Constantinople was really overseeing the Eastern churches, and Pope Leo IX overseeing the Western churches. And they started having a lot of theological disagreements and writing letters back and forth. And the more disagreements they had, the more rebellious this Michael, the patriarch of Constantinople of the Eastern churches, got. And eventually, Pope Leo IX was like, we need to put this guy in check. And it seems like nothing's working, so we got to excommunicate this guy. So he prepares a whole thing, sends a cardinal to go deliver him his excommunication. And before the cardinal could go, Pope Leo IX dies. And then the cardinal just goes anyway while the seat is vacant. And he goes, delivers this message of saying you're excommunicated. And know what Michael does? He says, no, you're excommunicated. And he excommunicates the cardinal and his entourage, which I think is just one of the funniest parts of church history. It's like this huge excommunication, and the response is, no, you're excommunicated. And that's the beginning of the schism. That's all it took. I mean, of course, like I said, it was building and building and building over time, but that was it. That was the split right there. No, you're excommunicated. And then they got a new pope. And by the time they got a new pope, it was just like, yeah, it was split. It was done. Couldn't be reconciled. And so this guy, Pope Leo IX, led up to that, which I find so interesting, especially interesting because he was like so convinced that like, no, the church needs to stay united under me, under the Pope, under the leader of the Western church, and the Eastern churches need to just align with us. And I wonder if, like, first off, if those priests back then in the early church councils, when they decided who would be the Pope, if they knew how big Christianity would get, I wonder if they would have structured the leadership in the same way. if it would have been a little bit more democratized. And same here. I wonder if Pope Leo IX, if he knew how big and diverse the church would get, if he would have been more open to sharing power with this other patriarch. But for him, it was like, nope, everybody's got to just stay under my authority. And I think what we see over history is the Catholic Church, through an alliance with imperial powers, gaining more and more power and wealth and control that's needed to keep this giant Catholic Church of all these different churches. And there's diversity within them, but still ultimately under the authority of the Pope. But you need a great amount of power and wealth and control and influence in order to maintain that, to an extent that it goes so beyond, I think, what Jesus envisioned for these radical communities that shared property and took care of one another and tried to resist the rule of the empire through communal living. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting to think about that at the time of like how would things have been different if they knew where things were headed? But like I said, the Leos are in these historic moments. And this next one, again, in another historic moment. The next one that I'm going to mention, which was actually the very next Leo, Pope Leo X, 1513 to 1521, was his papacy. And guess what? This guy, the Pope during the Protestant Reformation, this was the guy who instituted indulgences, granting indulgences for donations for reconstructing St. Peter's Basilica. And indulgences at the time, I mean, it didn't have to be monetary. It could just be like you do something for the church, or you go do a good deed or something, and your sins are absolved, and you could go to heaven, or your family member could go to heaven. And eventually it became like more the focus on like just monetary indulgences. And that was a big thing under Pope Leo X. And that was one of Martin Luther's big beefs. And it was part of his 95 Theses that he nailed on that church door in Germany. And of course, many other beefs. And then later was heavily criticizing Leo X for a lot of things, but also in the way that Leo X was covering up sexual abuse and his also lavish lifestyle that Pope Leo X lived, and of course all the many theological differences. But this guy was the one that set Martin Luther off, and they had beef. They had beef until the very end of their lives. And Leo excommunicated Martin Luther. And again, it's interesting. These Leos. It's interesting we got a new Leo. And Leo IX and Leo X were the Leos during the two biggest church splits in history. The East-West Great Schism and the Protestant Reformation. Leo IX and Leo X. Very interesting, I think. Next Leo. This is the last one before we get to the new Leo. Leo the 13th. Of course, I left out a whole bunch of Leos. I just wanted to talk about some of the ones that I thought were interesting. But Leo the 13th, who's Pope 1878 to 1903, is really the guy that I think this new Leo was naming himself after. I'm sure he was considering all the other Leos that he liked too, but him naming himself Leo, I think, was a big message that he wanted to continue the legacy of this Leo, Leo the 13th, who was responsible for sparking Catholic social teaching in the modern age. Catholic social teaching really being about like how we live in this temporal world socially, and how do we structure society here and now among one another, and it requires us to involve ourselves in society and in politics, and requires us to take stances on politics, which a lot of Catholic social teaching gets into economics as well, of like a lot of Catholic social teaching is how do we care for those who are suffering politically? How do we care for the poor? The liberation theology is something that I'm super into. And if you've been watching my stuff for a while, I'm sure you know that. And liberation theology was a movement started in, as an official, systematic, officially labeled, named theology, liberation theology. I mean, you could put it back to the Bible if you want, but yeah, as like an official thing, starts in Latin America in the late 60s, and coined by Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian priest. Oh, wait, I think he was a priest. Yeah, he was. And this Leo, the new Leo, is also a citizen of Peru as well. He's got dual citizenship in the United States and Peru. Sorry, I just made that connection right now. But Gustavo Gutierrez was super inspired by Leo the 13th and the Catholic social teaching of that. And he wanted to take it a bit of a step further. But sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk a little bit more about Leo the 13th. He wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which is Latin for revolutionary change. And in this encyclical, this was typical of other Catholic social teaching, is he was talking about needing to have equality among people, fight for the rights of workers, the rights for trade unions, the rights for people and unions to strike for just wages, and the importance of supporting that as Christians. Like, it wasn't just politics. It was like always connecting with the Bible and older Christian teaching, and being able to say, like, as Christians or as Catholics, I'm not a Catholic, by the way, but I just dig this stuff. As Catholics, we should be called to care for the world, to get involved in society, to get involved in social justice. And so in this encyclical, I read it today for the first time. And it was interesting because, and this was a major thing he was known for, writing this thing. And a lot of people will still quote from it today. And it's interesting because he's criticizing capitalism in there, but he's also very strongly criticizing and rejecting socialism. And I'm a socialist, by the way. And so it was interesting to read, especially in light of like the later liberation theologians who were straight up socialists within a Latin American context. And what's interesting, though, when you read his criticism of socialism, at the root of both his criticism of socialism and capitalism is his belief that private property is a natural right to all humans. And each man, because like this is also before women had a larger role in the workplace, he believed each man should have access to the resources they need to provide for himself and his family. And so his support for trade unions and just wages and his rejection of socialism are both rooted in that. he believed that socialists' rejection of private property and them arguing for collectively owned property was just continuing the same problem of people having a difficult time having access to the resources they need to provide for their family. So he was like totally for private property, but he just believed it should be more accessible to everyone. That every person, every man, every family should have the right to private property and should have access to owning their own property from a wage that is high enough in order to get them that private property. And so he believed that it was wrong for anyone to be paid a wage that couldn't afford them property. I'm sure he would be very angry at the wage system today, where it's because it wasn't like, I mean, today people argue like if you're not making a living wage, and just get another job, or just go to school so you could get a better job. But I think for Leo, it was like, no, if you're working, if you're giving your energy and effort to labor, then that you should automatically be able to afford property. And it's wrong for anyone to be working and not be able to live. And so for him, that's what it was all about. And therefore, he fully supported just wages and unionization and strikes and workers' rights and getting children out of the workplace and being able to fight for better working conditions in general. And that was just like a Christian thing for him, which is like, I know it's funny. I think today we're used to like so many Christians being against workers fighting for just wages. And it's like you hear the conservative Christians being the ones being like, just get another job, or just get a second job, or raising minimum wage is socialism. Raising minimum wage, no, that's going to cause inflation. Raising minimum wage, if you want a better wage, then just get another job. It's so annoying, but not for Leo the 13th. And so, but here's the other thing. I disagree with him on like private property stuff, but because I just feel like inherently private property is always going to maintain this division between the two classes, that and the owning class, the capitalist class, will always find a way to hoard the means of production, but also land and property, in order to continue to make more and more and more and more money off of working people. And this Pope had a lot of faith that we could figure it out and get along. It's interesting to see. And I feel like if someone were to tell him the economic conditions that would be around 100 years after he wrote this stuff, I wonder if he would have changed his mind. But he believed that like everyone has the right to their own property, and your wage from your employer should be enough for you to afford that. And the two classes, the owning class or the ruling class and the working class, don't have to be in conflict like Karl Marx and these other socialists are always talking about, but they should be able to exist in harmony and agreement and equilibrium. And he believed that Christianity can help support this mutual relationship with each other, between the rich and the poor. I know I'm sure some of you are listening to this and like smirking and shaking your head like, bro is naive, especially when you consider where things went after the late 1800s. But it's still interesting to see That this is all from this motivation of like, well, yeah, of course, this is what our faith should lead us to. And so I wanted to read this part from the encyclical where he said, doubtless, before we can decide whether wages are adequate, many things have to be considered. But rich men and masters should remember this, that to exercise pressure for the sake of gain upon the indigent and destitute, and to make one's profit out of the need of another, is condemned by all laws, human and divine. To defraud anyone of wages that are his due is a crime which cries to the avenging anger of heaven. And this is straight up from the Bible he quotes. He says, behold the hire of the laborers, which by fraud has been kept back by you, crieth, and the cry of them hath entered the ears of the Lord of Sabbaths. And then he says, finally, the rich must religiously refrain from cutting down the workman's earnings, either by force, fraud, or by usurious dealing, and with the more reason because the poor man is weak and unprotected, and because his slender means should be sacred in proportion to their scantiness. Were these precepts carefully obeyed and followed, would not strife die out and cease? So he's like, there's a way to do this. This is like the modern day conscious capitalists, where it's like, what if we just like agree to be nice, to be nice to each other? And he believed that Christianity was needed to make this change. Like he even said, religion alone can destroy the evil at its root. It's like all we need is religion. Just religion. That's all. Just religion could do the job. Like here's this other quote. He said, but if Christian precepts prevail, the two classes will not only be united in the bonds of friendship, but also those of brotherly love. For they will understand and feel that all men are the children of the common Father, that is, of God, that all have the same end, which is God himself, who alone can make either men or angels absolutely and perfectly happy, that all and each are redeemed by Jesus Christ and raised to the dignity of children of God, and are thus united in brotherly ties both with each other and with Jesus Christ. And he's saying this to say, we just got to teach the rich this. That's all we got to do. And then everything will be fair. They'll finally treat workers right. That's all we need. And I think that's very naive. But I think he's got the right idea of like recognizing the changes that need to be made. It's just that as time would tell us, especially as you see fascism rise and after his death in different countries, you would begin to see that like this isn't changing this division that exists via exploitation of workers. It needs to be the whole thing needs to be transformed. We can't just teach people to be nicer. It reminds me of like how there were Christians back in toward the end of chattel slavery in the United States who were saying we just need to teach slaveholders to just be nicer to the people that they're enslaving. The good Christian slave master doesn't beat their slaves, is able to just be good and nice and teach them things and see them differently compared to the sinful, evil slave masters who are mean and beat their slaves and are especially violent. And it's like, no, the relationship between a slave master and a slave needs to just end. And Frederick Douglass even considered, he also criticized wage slavery in general, which is simply just, which is what he used the term wage slavery to refer to just the wage system in general, which is like capitalist, owns capital, owns the means of production, and hires workers to create the products, and then the workers don't own anything of what they created. They're just selling their labor, and then they get a paycheck from the employer of whatever the employer wants to pay them. And that system where the workers have no stakes in what they're creating, have no ownership over what they're creating, have no ownership over the means of making it, over the company that makes it. And all decisions have to be, are only decided by the owner. That ultimately is an exploitative relationship that exacerbates this inequality. It's like, no matter how nice you treat the workers, the inequality within the relationship at the root needs to be transformed. And so, later, more people, more Christians would start to see this. And we get to liberation theology, liberation theologians in Latin America, this council of bishops in Latin America, seeing the context of socialist revolutions and within Latin America, and recognizing poverty, I think, at a level that Pope Leo XIII did not understand, and recognizing the radical need for transformation, the radical need for real revolutionary change. And I like this quote from Gustavo Gutierrez, who said he was inspired by Leo XIII, but it's like just taking it a step further. In the book, A Theology of Liberation, Gustavo Gutierrez said this: attempts to bring about changes within the existing order have proven futile. This analysis of the situation is at the level of scientific rationality. Only a radical break from the status quo, that is, a profound transformation of the private property system, access to power of the exploited class, and a social revolution that would break this dependence, would allow for the change to a new society, a socialist society, or at least allow that such a society might be possible. I like that. And yeah, it's like people starting to realize, like, no, we won't be able to make the change by just convincing people to be Christian, especially, like I said, with rising fascism after his death, that was inspired by Christianity. I mean, in Spain, Franco, that was Catholic fascism. Bro was Catholic. The country was Catholic. That's what you wanted, right? Pope Leo XIII? And they were fascists. Like, it requires just a totally different understanding of how religion and politics actually functions in people's lives. And I mean, part of the difference with liberation theology, too, is being more inspired by materialist analysis, the historical materialist analysis that Karl Marx wrote about. And being able to use that analysis as a tool, because it's not like socialism was like a new religion or new belief or new ideology. It was an analytical tool for analyzing the economy and analyzing historical shifts in political economy, particularly between classes. And so using that tool, these Catholics, right, and within the beginning of liberation theology in Latin America, were able to say, okay, the Bible teaches us that we need to care for the poor. But in order to do that materially, in order to be practical about it, in order to really make that happen, we see, based on historical material analysis, that it can't just happen through changing people's minds, but we have to actually transform the material conditions themselves by not just giving the poor charity, as Catholicism has always taught from the very beginning, but by supporting them and their struggle to take power from those who are making them poor. And so that's a totally different shift. And Pope Francis was very aware of liberation theology, and he like re-welcomed Gustavo Gutierrez back into the Catholic Church because he had beef with his own pope, or rather the Pope had beef with him. But it's so interesting to read for me about just the evolution of this stuff. I'm kind of a nerd about it, but let me continue. I didn't think it would take me this long to get to the new Leo, but here we are. It's a podcast. It's okay. Leo the 14th, Robert Prevost, American Pope, also Peruvian, Italian and French descent, I guess. That's what Google told me. And, talking about socialism, this Laura Loomer character, super right-wing person, I just thought it was funny. She responded to one of Robert Prevost's old tweets from July 2015, where he shared an article called "Why Donald Trump's Anti-Immigrant Rhetoric is So Problematic." Because, he was critical of Trump's anti-immigration policies, and then later was also critical in sharing articles that were critical of J.D. Vance and his policies. He shared an article called J.D. Vance is Wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others, which I talked a lot more about in the episode I did about Pope Francis. But Laura Loomer responded to this tweet from 2015, all caps, "Woke Marxist Pope," which I thought was hilarious, especially because people used to call Pope Francis Marxist. He was like far from it, but even this guy, again, far from it. Woke Marxist Pope. I'm like, I wish. When are we going to get a woke Marxist Pope? That's what I'm waiting for, y'all. But it's funny because this conservative says that. This other conservative, Charlie Kirk, big political pundit, right-wing influencer dude, was like, made this little video, and he's like, I disagree with some of his criticism of Trump, but he's a registered Republican, and he has a Republican voting record in primaries. So, and he's super pro-life. So he was like hopeful about it. And then I saw some other conservatives that are just like, yeah, American Pope, let's go. Oh, man. Yeah, it's too much. But yeah, again, you see this debate about like, is he progressive? Is he conservative? Let's look at his record. Here's a time he said something kind of progressive and inclusive. Here's another time, not so much. And a similar debate that you saw with Pope Francis that I talked about in that other episode. And criticizing Trump and J.D. Vance for their anti-immigration policies. Also, in 2020, he tweeted in support of George Floyd, and he wrote, "We need to hear more from leaders in the church to reject racism and seek justice." And he also criticized Trump for the Muslim ban. And also, at the same time, this dude is pretty anti-abortion, also anti-same-sex relationships. In 2012, I guess he said he was criticizing families of same-sex partners adopting children, and was criticizing schools for the promotion of gender ideology and creating genders that don't exist. And I think for some of you, you may think, well, yeah, duh, he's a Catholic. But it's funny. This is what I was seeing people point out today of like, yeah, but what about this? I just wanted to point it out too. Because it's like, again, this debate of like, here's something inclusive he said, or here's something exclusive he said. Here's something cool he said. Here's something not cool at all that he said. When in reality, I think he's just like Pope Francis, and that he's a conservative traditionalist Catholic who just takes his faith seriously, which winds up getting you to have some pretty radical views. And I think if you really take your Christian faith seriously and take the Bible seriously, you should just be default welcoming to immigrants, default critical of anti-immigration policies, especially the ones by Trump. Like, that should just be default for every Christian if they actually took their faith seriously. And I think that's what we see in Pope Francis, and that's what we're seeing in the new Pope, Pope Leo the 14th. That's all. I think that's all it is. No, I don't think it makes much sense to try to put him in that binary. Is he conservative? Is he progressive? He's like, I think he's like a moderate. Takes his faith seriously. So of course, he's going to say some inclusive stuff too, because if you take your faith seriously, you should be at least a bit inclusive. And so there it is. There it is, y'all. That's Leo the 14th. There's a bit of the Leos. We got a Leo Pope. And we'll see what happens after this. I hope you found some of this interesting, talking about the Leos. Shout out all the astrological Leos out there. Thanks for sticking around. And I'll see y'all next week. Okay? Bye-bye.